Yes, there we
Yeah,
go.
yeah, we are. Hey, Tatyana.
Hi.
Hey, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you
Uh,
for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you as my guest, and I'm very much looking forward for our dialogue. First, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, of course. So my name is Tatyana Serraino. I was born in Cyprus to an Italian father and a Danish Armenian mother. I have a BA in art history from the University of Cambridge, St. John's College, an MA in the same subject, which I did at John Cabot University in Rome. And then I also have a second MA in arts and culture management, which I did at Rome Business School. And currently I'm based in London and I work as an art historian and a content creator, as well as a freelance broadcaster and author.
Wow, so much. Well, let's dive in. First, tell us about your YouTube channel.
So my YouTube channel is called About Art. And it's one of a few social media channels that I use to talk about art. YouTube was my very first venture into the world of video making, but I'm also active on TikTok and Instagram. And the idea behind the channel, or the aim, was to make art and art history accessible, fun, and engaging, and fresh. Because I found over the years, as I was studying it and exploring the subject, that it tends to be regarded sometimes as rather an elitist subject that people sometimes feel scared to talk about, or they're not sure how to approach. Whereas I absolutely loved it. Ever since the first class that I had doing art history, I realized that it's such a wonderful way to explore humanity throughout the ages and to connect with people in different cultures through art. And so the aim behind the channel was to just make videos on some of my favorite artwork, some of my favorite artists, exploring their work, their intentions, their stories. And I really enjoyed doing it, and I got a good response from it too. So I've continued ever since.
Well, I love your YouTube channel. You know, these algorithms of YouTube magic, I don't know even how to call it, technology, whatever. It was recommended to me and I start watching one video and like, oh, this is great. So I watched that or mainly listen because I was washing dishes, to be honest. But it was interesting and I was interested in talking to you and thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me.
I started doing this podcast because people don't know about art or art history. And when I spoke about especially Paleolithic art, nobody knows or very few people know about cave art or what is known as Venus of Willendorf or Venus of Bressanpuy, but ladies or women. We don't know were they worshipped or not, and so on and so on. So I started doing this and for me, it was always to find a definition of art and to see who decides what qualifies an art. So, what do you think about that?
Oh gosh, yes, it's a big question, isn't it? It's a difficult one. So what qualifies as art? I think it's changed over the years. I mean, we've been making art since ever as humanity, and initially it was a way to express, I think, and record experiences. It's changed over the years. I think now, if you were to ask me what qualifies as art, I think it's anything that is made with the intention of being art. It's very much down to the creator, because you could end up making, you know, whether it's a painting, whether it's a sculpture, if you're making it with the intention of creating something that doesn't have a functional purpose per se. So it's, you know, a table is meant to support something, but if you're making a table that doesn't necessarily have to support something, then I think that would qualify as a work of art.
Isn't that a craft to make a table?
Well, I think that's the small difference. If your intention is to make something that's more than a table, in any which way that may be, then all of a sudden it's a work of art. So I don't think it's limited to mediums as per se, or to you know, what you're making. I think it's more the intention.
I want to have this profound meaning to find definition of art, to find what makes people do art, why I'm doing art, why do you study art, why do you have a MA. What I noticed is that people don't like to learn, they like to have understanding. And with contemporary art, the gap between audience and artist and those who understand art is just widening and widening and widening. So there is a big gap between it. So why do you think is that?
That's a very good point. And I have to be honest as well, as an art historian, so I like art that comes mostly from the past. In particular, art from the 16th, 17th centuries. So Italian Baroque art is my absolute favorite. I find it very, very hard to talk about contemporary art because I don't understand it as much. And I think what you're saying is very, very true, that there seems to be this gap perhaps between us as the audience or the receivers, the creators, and those who organize or exhibit or have a say regarding the exhibition of the art. I think part of the reason why we feel that distance is paradoxically because we're so close to it. So the fact that we exist at the same time as these artists who are creating works of art, we don't have any societal, cultural, historical distance that allows us to have this perspective, which is a big part of understanding art that comes from the past. So, for example, if you look at Baroque art that was created in the 17th century, we know that Baroque art was created with a very specific aim in mind. It was the Roman Catholic Church's almost advertising campaign to fight back against Protestantism. It was a way to reintroduce art and bring people back into the Roman Catholic Church. And we're able to understand that because we have that historical perspective. When it comes to contemporary art, I think we're so close to it, perhaps we aren't able to have the same sort of perspective. So that could be perhaps a reason why it's a little bit harder for us to connect with the art. I don't know what you think about that, but that may be one possible reason.
I studied art on two different academies, and I went to art school instead of regular high school. So I was classically trained. Later on, it became more, let's do contemporary art in sense of installations and performances. And what I noticed that a lot of people did performances because they're easier to do it than to paint a painting. I had many friends who were conceptual artists, and they would make these concepts on the get-go, and sometimes it was very strange because they would intellectualize too much about it and they will lose audience. You understand me what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's interesting conceptual art, isn't it? Because, sometimes it's the meaning is that there perhaps is no meaning behind the artwork. And that in itself is a very profound idea to experiment with. And it can be tricky because it's both quite limiting, but also it opens up a variety of interpretations for the audience themselves. Sometimes to the extent that there's so many different ways to interpret a contemporary work of art that you just end up feeling more lost. And I think that's just, I suppose, part of the nature of where we're at as a society at the moment. I think. I mean, all art is a reaction to something that's come before, and you can see that throughout the ages from the beginning of time. If you look at, for example, Impressionism, that was the reason why it was so revolutionary, is because it was reacting against the academic style of painting that was prevalent in France at the time. And when Impressionism first started, people didn't understand it. And in fact, it had a very sort of unsupportive reaction initially. Maybe that's what we're experiencing at the moment with contemporary art still, this fact that it's sort of, or conceptual art, it's still very, perhaps in a sense, unfamiliar to us. And I think, as you said, when it comes to performances particularly, there's less for us to focus on visually. It's more an experience. So it's harder to pin things down, as it were. And the thought process, as you said, can be very, very intellectualized sometimes. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's very exciting, but it can be harder in a sense to understand the intention behind a work of art.
Yeah, but that begs the question, how does the intention of an artist influence the meaning of an artwork?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question that art historians have to consider always. How much can you trust the intention of the artist, and how much does it matter actually at the end of the day? I think with art of the past, there's always this temptation to look at the lives of artists and how that plays into their artwork. But that can be quite a dangerous game sometimes. In most cases, that you can always see a very clear link between what the artists go through and the art that they create. For example, if you look at Caravaggio, one of my favorite artists, he wasn't the best of humans. To put it lightly, but he committed a number of crimes throughout his life, and including a murder as well. And, there's something about his art that is incredibly dramatic and dark and engaging and violent. And so there is that temptation to link his life with his art. I think I've almost lost track of what we were saying. Oh, yes, the intention of the artist, I suppose, and how much you can read into that. I think it is important, but I think at the same time, you do have to focus on the art as well objectively and sort of find a way to unite the two. So the intention, but also the context, the historical context, I think is important as well. It also plays a part in how we interpret a work of art. And then also it's good to always just focus on the artwork itself. Studying art history, we were always taught that the number one thing that you have to do, the most important skill, is looking closely, because purely just from looking, you will learn and figure out so much about a work of art yourself before you look into any scholarship, before you look into the artist's life or their intention. That's the first step into understanding and digesting a work of art. I think with art nowadays, it certainly helps if you have the artist say a few words, but also, you it's also fun to just look at the artwork and look at how it's been made and the effect that it has on the audience and sort of make your own conclusion from it, I suppose. I don't know what you think, how important the intention is.
Well, French poet Jacques Prévert,
Mm-hmm.
he said, why people are bothering why Rimbaud stopped writing when they don't know why he started in the first place. It's interesting to think about what is the relationship of intention and artwork and how it's interpreted and so on. Can art exist without an audience, or is it valued from a big experience and interpreted?
That's a really great question. I think part of the reason why we love art is because we're always able to connect to it on some level, because it's such a raw and unfiltered expression of human experience and emotion. It always helps to have an audience, and art has had an audience for such a long time, but I don't necessarily think it has to have an audience to exist as art. And I'll give you an example, one of my favorite examples. The artist Goya, he had quite a troubled life towards I think the second half of his life ended up being not so great, and he ended up turning deaf, I think, and Spanish politics really sort of troubled him at a certain extent, and he ended up living in this home isolated by himself and living there by himself after experiencing these political turmoil and sort of turning part deaf and just feeling quite emotionally disturbed. I think he ended up creating, for me, what is one of the most disturbing works of art of all time, which is Saturn devouring his own son. And that he actually painted on a wall in this house of his, in the dining room to be exact. And it was never intended to be seen by anyone. And it wasn't until after his death that it was actually discovered and then, sort of turned into a work of art per se, in the sense that, it had an audience. But before it had an audience, Goya was its audience. I think he created it for himself, and it was a mode of expression. And that in itself is art. If you're creating something with the intention of expressing either a feeling, whether you can pinpoint that feeling or not, the very act of just putting something that you feel inside into a physical form is art, I think.
Now I'm thinking about these old Paleolithic carvings or engravings in the entrances of the caves, but
Yes.
all the big paintings, all those galleries are so back in the cave when nobody can see them.
Yeah.
We don't know, we can speculate what it meant, but what do you think how the art started in the first place?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know too much about ancient art, to be honest, Paleolithic art, but I think initially the very, very first art that was created, I think, was similar to Goya's instance. I think it was purely a mode of personal expression without any sort of political intent behind it. I think it was just a way for humans to kind of experience or express part of their experience. I believe, but I could be wrong. I don't know too much about the very, very initial artworks that were created. But going back to your point, this is kind of making me think that, as we're having this discussion, I suppose that art always will have an audience in some sense, even if that audience is purely just the artists themselves. Because as you're creating the art and as soon as it's finished, you are in constant dialogue with it. So in a sense, I think there's just a distinction as to what kind of audience there will be, whether it's the audience being the creator themselves, or whether it's more of an intentional audience in the sense that you're creating something to either sway or influence or spark controversy. Sorry, my mind is just sort of turning as we're discussing
Yeah,
just
mine
the
too,
points,
mine
which
too.
is great.
Yeah. That's why I called it art dialogues. When people think about art, they usually put this adjective beautiful or amazing.
Yeah.
So, do you think that art should be beautiful? No. But what is the relationship between art and beauty? Can something be art without being beautiful?
Oh gosh, yeah, this is a really important question too that always comes up in the history of art, and I still don't really have an answer, I suppose. I think beautiful is a very interesting word because it has this sort of connotation of something being attractive physically. It's right in a sense to describe art as beautiful, but without that limiting capacity of the word itself. Because something doesn't have to sort of be pretty in order to be beautiful when it comes to art. And what I mean by that is if you take Duchamp's most famous work, the I'm sure.
Pissoir.
Yes, the toilet essentially
Yeah.
that by no means is beautiful, but it was beautiful in the way that it created a dialogue and it completely changed what art was considered to be. Art is beautiful if it has an effect that's not only visually pleasing.
Then what you're explaining is poetics, not beautiful.
Yes, I suppose you're right. Yeah, I think I'm swaying a little bit more into poetics. If we're talking about purely the beautiful aspects of a painting, I think that art does not have to be beautiful then, and that's in that case. I think that as long as it's perhaps impactful is a better word. Poetic, impactful. It's able to sort of spark an emotion, and that doesn't necessarily have to be an emotion constituting, oh, that's beautiful. It could be an emotion that's more like, oh my goodness, I feel something. I feel terrified. I feel disturbed. That is also, I think, what makes good art.
As you said about Goya, his drawings and engravings of
Yes.
Spanish Inquisition and what French Napoleonic soldiers did to Spanish people when they conquered Spain. And when you spoke about art being observed only by an artist, the first name that pops on my mind is Van Gogh.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
We are now admiring his work, but he killed himself because he didn't have anything to eat. So if art is subjective, is there an objective standards then that we as a art historians, artists and audience look up to?
Are there sort of visual standards that we expect when it comes to art, I suppose, is maybe what you're asking, or visual or preconceptions, things that we consider.
Thank you.
It's a difficult concept. It really is. And this is why I love art history so much, because it really kind of it raises questions about how you interpret and how you look at the world and how we understand each other as well. Because different cultures over different times have used different forms of art to express themselves, and there's no right or wrong. I think that's something I can never argue, but when it comes to art, there's no right or wrong way to do it. There have been different standards or objective expectations put in place over different times. Art is essentially an expression of the human experience, so it cannot be expected to conform to a specific style or mode of expression as long as it's being expressed. It's a difficult question, but again, my mind goes back to Impressionism as a style, which was just so completely different to what was expected at the time, or the desired output that was kind of put in place by a specific institution. Just before Impressionism came about, the most prestigious institution in France, known as the Academy, was basically making the decisions per se when it came to works of art. They were organizing this very important annual exhibition, the Paris Salon, which was very, in a sense, strict. It was a little bit restrictive because artworks had to be approved by a board of academicians. So in that sense, what they were doing is they were imposing certain criteria when it came to art, right? So I think what you're saying is that there have been throughout history these sort of brackets of expectation or certain standards that have been demanded. But the reason why Impressionism became such an important style of art is because it so strongly went against those standards at the Academy. So the Academy wanted historical subject matter, they wanted smooth finish, they wanted highly detailed works of art. Impressionism did everything the other way. They didn't look at history, they looked at the present day. They didn't have smooth finishes, they had impasto and these quick, rapid, short brushstrokes. We can't help it as a society to sort of impose these expectations over time because it gives us a sense of control, or it helps us to maybe, I'm not sure actually what the reason is. But the beauty of art is when it kind of breaks those rules, right? Rules were made to be broken, I suppose, is another way to look at it.
Also, Impressionists never use black color.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yes. Yeah. I've never thought of that actually. Yes. But they definitely certainly like to use much brighter colors. Yeah.
Yes, and if something was darker, they would use Prussian blue. How does art influence our perception of reality and maybe understanding of human conditions or
Wow.
world around us?
Yeah, no, I'm really enjoying this, by the way, because this is the beauty of art, the fact that it opens up all these amazing questions. I think your question is fantastic because art really does draw attention to how we perceive the world and the fact that each of our perceptions are unique and subjective. So as you were saying, in Paleolithic times, they didn't have, the full range of colors perhaps that artists coming later did, but nevertheless, they were able to convey visual objects and animals that were recognizable to others using a limited color palette. So I think what art makes us learn or understand is that our perception of the world is different to how things probably exist in reality. And the
Yeah,
beauty of art is being able to see past the reality or what merely exists before us. I think art has the amazing capacity in the way that photographs don't to capture not only a moment as it may appear, but the feeling behind it or the subjective experience feeling that each of us would have. So even when it comes to the Paleolithic works of art, for example, that you say portray, for example, a bull using just a red color, we know that bulls were never red or that particular animal were never red. But during that moment in time, they experienced it as red in the medium of art that they created. So it's a window into a specific time in history that really expands what we might call reality in itself. It allows us to go one step further. I don't know if I'm making sense, by the way, but a really interesting example that comes to mind, because as you said, realism is a fairly new concept. I mean, if you look at ancient Roman sculptures of emperors, they do appear very realistic, idealized. I mean, their bodies are incredibly perfect and muscular, but their faces were, in a sense, quite realistic in the sense that we recognize them very much as humans. And the idea behind those sculptures was to create recognizable physical replication of that figure that could be seen by the general public. But then the Roman Empire crumbled. You have the rise of the medieval. And in that instance, art is by no means realistic in the way that we might term it today. Because you have these elongated figures, you have a lot of gold leaf being implemented. That was intentional. It was the artist's intent to create an art that was recognizable but did not necessarily feel familiar, because during the medieval time, art was used as a way to connect people with something higher, which is, be it the heavens, God, whatever that may be. And so that's the beauty of art, the fact that it can suggest at something that is not necessarily visible to us in reality, be it an experience, be it an idea beyond reality, something immaterial. Art is able to capture and communicate and translate that.
can art be the truth? Is it subjective? Is it objective truth? Can art be a form of truth? And is it different from philosophy than philosophical truth or scientific truth about the world around us?
It's definitely about truth, and I think in most cases it's about the truthfulness of the artist's own experience. That's undeniable. It's the purest form of expression, and that in itself is truth, I think. Art is a truthful expression of how somebody perceived life at a particular moment in time. And I think that's undeniable. Because no matter, what time you're living in, what you create is I don't know. This is a really hard question, actually. And
Sorry, I won't ask you hard questions anymore.
No, it's great because it's very challenging. I think it's different. As you said, scientific truth, I think, is very different because that cannot be argued in a sense. You have proof always. But art is truthful in a different way because it's such a sort of a subjective experience of a subjective expression of one's own experience that in itself is also undeniable, or you cannot discuss or kind of deny its truthfulness. No. And I think art is also, I'm not sure if this relates to truth, but it's one of the it's one of the clearest forms of understanding a society as well in a particular moment of time. I think it grants us such a privileged insight into the mindset behind a particular moment in history and the people living during that time. For example, to go back to, let's say, paintings by Caravaggio. I mean, if you look at the intention behind those works and the fact that these works were created in order to bring people back into the church or to incite emotion, it really helps you to understand the context and the sort of the contrast between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism and how they went about understanding the world. So I think art is very truthful in that sense, in the sense that it kind of grants us this privileged window into certain aspects of our history, but it's also not as definite as scientific truth because it's also very subjective and personal at the same time. So that's, I think, the beauty of art. It's it's both very personal, but it can also be used with incredible political and social intent. And it's finding the balance, or perhaps recognizing the balance between that, is special.
Why is there no female artists in Renaissance or Middle Ages or time of Baroque?
There we go. The age-old question. I think so. I mean, for a long time, females have been limited very, very heavily when it comes to the world of art. During the medieval times, I think art was considered to be more of a craft. I think the very concept of artist in itself was born in the Renaissance, right? So people who created art didn't have necessarily the same standing that we consider today when it comes to being called an artist. And in fact, during the Middle Ages, I mean, we don't really have many names of artists. It's more just, works of art that were created by a group or by, certain so-and-so and his entourage, which is also always the case, by the way. So that's another interesting thing to point out. But even artists such as Michelangelo, they always had an entourage behind them. So even though Michelangelo was the driving force and he had envisioned everything and sort of was the leading figure, he always had a few hands there to help him execute the vision. When it came to the Renaissance, there were a few female artists that we are trying our best to kind of bring to the fore and make more known. The issue back then was that women were just essentially forbidden from practicing art. It was just a cultural thing. They weren't allowed to study the female nude figure. So that was extremely limiting because that's how you learn, or that's how you used to learn during the Renaissance, by studying the nude figure, because it allowed you to understand how the body looks and also to then replicate it realistically. Women were not allowed to practice or study art. A few were able to enter the world. One of my favorite examples, Artemisia Gentileschi. She was very heavily inspired by Caravaggio, and you can see actually from the wonderful paintings that she made that they incorporate a lot of chiaroscuro and they have the same sort of sense of drama that Caravaggio uses. But her father was a very successful painter, Orazio Gentileschi, and so he was the one who taught her and introduced her and brought her into that world, luckily so. Women didn't have that opportunity, so even if they were to practice art at home, they didn't have the same ease, as it were, to exhibit their art and to make a name for themselves. I think another reason why there are no such, there's not many great female artists that we know of, that's a very important distinction to make, that we know of, is because we have very important writers such as, for example, Giorgio Vasari, created these wonderful chronicles of artists' lives that were extremely dramatized and fun and give us a privileged window into what life was like back then. But what they do is they create this idea of the male genius. But yes, there we go. I think part of the reason why, or probably the biggest reason why, is because women just did not have access to academies and were just not allowed into that sphere. Thankfully, we have those who were able to sort of break through. One of my favorite female artists, by the way, Plautilla Nelli, she was active during the Renaissance. She was the very first woman to ever paint a Last Supper. I don't know if you've heard about her, Plautilla Nelli.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Great. Excellent. Because not many people do.
But that's why I'm making this podcast.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm making all of this not to educate people. No, I'm not an educator. But to tell them, hey, there was this or that. And especially in Paleolithic, we don't know who the artist was. Maybe it was all women who made their self-portraits and self-figurines.
Yes. Very good point. Very good point. Exactly. Especially during the Paleolithic times, we just don't have the records to kind of make that distinction. And it's funny that sometimes we assume that it might just be a man behind the creation of that art, right? Why were there no women artists versus why are there no women artists that we know of? Because of course there were. There were fewer because of limiting circumstances, but there were amazing artists. Plautilla Nelli is probably my favorite. She existed at a time when, again, women were forbidden from practicing art, but she lived in this convent and she built a thriving art business. She taught herself how to paint, and she did so by looking at the work of her contemporaries. So she was looking at the paintings by Bronzino and other Italian artists, and she just went for it. And she ended up creating a fantastic Last Supper painting and then teaching other women in her convent how to paint. So there were ways around it, but it was still at the same time quite limiting. We have to recognize that it was quite limiting for women.
I don't remember her last name. Camilla. She was Rodin's girlfriend at the time. Do you know her?
Camille Claudel?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the 1800s, Camille was a sculptor, and her brother put her into a mental asylum because he thought that she was mad. There's those stories as well.
I mean, even if you look at pre-Raphaelite artists such as Rossetti, who's another one of my favorite painters, there were so many female pre-Raphaelite artists too, who are usually just sort of labeled as the muses or the models of these male artists. But they, in a sense, also, they very much were successful practicing artists as well. And it's funny how we don't tend to learn about them as much.
It's important to me that people know they were female artists.
Yeah.
Women were not allowed to be actors for a really long time, as you know.
Yeah. It's funny because art history is such a you realize that it is such a sort of, it's a discipline, it's an academic discipline. And like many disciplines, you know, sometimes men have more of a say when it comes to founding that discipline. And so I think that's another reason maybe why women have kind of fallen through the cracks. As you said, I have no doubt that women have been creating art since ever, but it's just a distinction that we have to make between knowing that there were female artists and that they just weren't recorded perhaps in the same way that male artists were, because of people like Giorgio Vasari, who fabricated these narratives, as it were, that were very selective through no fault of their own. But you know, his writings survived when others didn't necessarily, as you said. So it's many different factors that come into play. But it's our job now, knowing that there's more to be studied and more to be explored, to continue bringing to the fore all these amazing artists who were women who created astounding works of art that need to be recognized as equal to their male counterparts.
But also, you mentioned really good, there's no opportunities for women to be an artist. But also, do you think that there was less desire to be an artist if there's no opportunity?
That's a very good question. I think if you're an artist, then you have a drive that cannot be quenched. And I think that goes for no matter what time you may be living in. I think we all have this innate desire as humans to express ourselves, be it through painting or through music or through dance. So I think there's never a lesser desire. I think maybe economically but then again, I mean, artists were not paid as much as we believe that they were until the late Renaissance. Then that's when they started to become, as it were, these sort of important artistic sought after figures.
Tizian.
Sorry?
Tizian, the painter.
Titian, yes, yeah.
Oh, I pronounced it like Tiziano. Titian. Okay. Tiziano was the first painter that I know of that was actually paid good money, and he made a living out of it.
Yeah.
Michelangelo Buonarroti support himself doing the statues by saying yes to be a painter for the Pope.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Which is incredible.
So, can art be ethically evaluated? If I do an art to provoke you, am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to provoke you just because I want to provoke you? Or if you are provoked without my intention, is it still allowed?
I think, again, it depends on what time you're living in. I think it's changed. During the Renaissance, it was less about provoking and more about pleasing what was expected, conforming to what was expected. So then, artists were being asked to create beautiful, harmonious, symmetrical works of art. So if you were to create something that was not that, you would be provoking in a way that was not good. Whereas now, the more of a reaction a work of art elicits, the better it's considered to be. That's changed over time as well, I think. I think in the past, at least we have enough of historical distance to recognize that art for a very long time throughout the ages, yes, it's always been a mode of expression, but it's also been used very strongly to influence a public politically, not provoke, but influence, which I think is very different. Whereas now it's more about perhaps provoking intentionally. So if you think of, for example, during the Renaissance, I mean, artists didn't necessarily have the same amount of freedom that they do today. I mean, art was always being commissioned in most cases by the church, right? Or by popes, or by important figures. And artists were being asked to portray particular subjects in a particular way. So they had less freedom, as it were, for complete creative expression. Whereas today, yes, artists are sometimes commissioned, but in most cases, I think the best art is just one that comes from within and doesn't have limitations, as it were, imposed on it.
So what's the role of an artist in society?
Very good question. The role of the artist is to bring a degree of creativity that is inspiring and surprising. So if you look at Michelangelo, for example, one of his most famous works was the David, that was commissioned by the Florentine government at the time. And they asked him to create a particular subject. But the way in which he portrayed David was revolutionary without being too provocative for the context in which it was commissioned. He was the very first artist to portray David before defeating Goliath and not after, standing victorious with the decapitated head of Goliath in his hand. So that, in a sense, already very much changed the power and the message of the artwork. It's more about anticipation as opposed to victory. The way he chose to depict David as a sort of awkward youth that appears both calm, collected, but also quite aware of the task at hand. I think it's those small elements of creativity and vision and execution that make an artist an artist.
You spoke about inspiration of others. So can art inspire social change?
Yes, absolutely, I think. Absolutely. And it has done. Art is an extremely powerful vessel. I think we discussed this before because it's both an incredibly truthful expression of one's own personal experience, but it can also be used to sway others. If you look at, for example, paintings of Napoleon, there's a painting by Jacques-Louis David of Napoleon crossing the Alps.
Yeah.
Yes, you must. I mean, it's an incredibly famous painting, and it's so highly dramatized and idealized. You have this heroic-looking Napoleon on this horse that's depicted mid-gallop, as it were, and the wind is billowing through his hair, and his cloak is sort of surrounding him dramatically, and it looks like he's the only figure leading his troops across the Alps, whereas in reality it really wasn't the case. He crossed the Alps, I think, a few days or after his initial troops went over. He wasn't riding a horse, he was riding a different, I think a
donkey.
A donkey, exactly. So that shows you the power of art and its ability to kind of modify reality ever so slightly in a way that sways your opinion of a person or of a situation. And it can make you either, warm to that person or be inspired by that person to a greater degree. If you look at political campaigns, I mean, that is very, very crafted always. And it's the same with art. It's just a different, today we're experiencing it through TV and through posters or through also through social media, but it's the same idea. We're using visual media to influence and kind of heighten and modify and sway people's opinions of a particular situation. And that's what art has been for so long before photography and technology came into play.
Speaking of political campaigns, most famous political campaign was done actually by Romans. Politicians, of course, today are very uneducated in that sense. They don't know art, but everything that they use, Romans used it before. There was this statue of Augustus. There was no TV. How can you see your Caesar? How can you see your ruler?
Yes.
So they mass-produced this statue. He has short-cut hair like Romans. He has toga, but underneath he has this armor ready to fight.
Yeah.
And he's barefoot, meaning that he's one of you,
exactly.
Blah, blah, blah. He created it.
It's so true, though. I mean, it's propaganda, no? And art has always been used in that sense. The subliminal messages that art is able to incite is actually incredibly, it can be terrifying sometimes to the extent that how powerful it can be. Our understanding or our perception of the world is influenced by art from the past to the extent that we don't even recognize it. Even poses, when political leaders are sort of delivering a speech, or the aura that you can exude from your body that for so long has been captured through sculptures, as you said. So one of the most famous poses from antiquity is the contrapposto, which is when you kind of lean your weight on one hip, and that exudes such a sense of confidence that was intentional behind the sculptures being created, because it exudes a sense of power and control.
Where that art comes from?
We all have an inherent need to create art in one way or another, whether that be through painting, through writing, through music, blah, blah, blah. But I think certain societies allow for the exhibition of art in different ways. In Western countries, there is more perhaps of an opportunity to exhibit art within a gallery setting or within an art fair. If you're looking at the purest form of creating art, that's something that we all have in common as humanity. You know, the way that we express ourselves is through something physical. That is art, no matter what it may be, whether singing, music, communication, performance.
What is art?
Art is human expression with the intention of being made as art.
How would you like to be remembered?
Oh gosh, I hope I would love to be remembered as somebody who spoke and foregrounded female artists, as well as just, you know, somebody who's known for talking about art and art history and making a difference in that field and how we approach the field.
If you had a chance to meet somebody, one person, group of people from history, historical characters, even fictional characters, who would it be and why?
I'm finding it hard to narrow down, but Caravaggio for sure. I'd love to have a conversation with Caravaggio just because I think his art, I mean, he's my favorite artist, and I think his art is so dramatic and controversial and provocative and deep and dark. But also Artemisia Gentileschi for similar reasons, and because she's one of the, you know, the best female artists that we know of. And Gian Lorenzo Bernini, my favorite sculptor, from, again, the same time. So as you see, they're all Baroque artists.
Yeah.
I have a particular...
And they live in the same time.
Here. They lived at the same time.
They overlap.
Yeah, they overlap. If I could have all three of them somehow at the table with me, then I'd be a happy person.
Okay, how people can find you?
Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. On TikTok, you can find me at Tatyana About Art, Tatyana with a Y. On YouTube, I think it's About Art by Tatyana. And Instagram is aboutart.tks.
Thank you for doing this. I'm very, very much happy that you said yes to this Art Dialogues. I had fun, and I hope that we will repeat this in the future again.
I would love nothing more. Thank you really for the opportunity and for having me on your show. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. It was a challenging dialogue in the best way, because you asked wonderful questions that really highlight the beauty of art, right? And the fact that it is a continuous dialogue and there is necessarily no right and wrong. It's just a chance for us to explore humanity and expression. So thank you.
No, thank you.
I really appreciated it. It's good to talk about stuff like this. It's not often that you get a chance to discuss heavy stuff, which I love. So thank you so much for for having me on the show.
Thank you.
Really, I had so much fun having this discussion with you, and really thank you for reaching out. And I hope it was okay.
No, it was brilliant.
Okay. Well, you're very good at it. I mean, you have a very calming presence, but you also ask very good questions. I really appreciated the conversation. So keep at it for sure.
Thank you very much for doing this, and I wish you good rest of the day off or whatever you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
And we'll stay in touch. Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.